Hi everyone. I've immigrated myself and rebuilt my life in another country, including my entire health insurance setup. And that's exactly why I know how underestimated this topic really is. Most people treat health insurance like a boring checkbox when moving abroad, something they'll figure out later. And I think that's a mistake. In this video, I'll walk you through the 6 things you absolutely need to understand before choosing expat health insurance that maybe looks cheap on paper, but will cost you years later. Make sure you watch until the end, because the last point is where expats mostly fail. Especially if you come from an EU country, the biggest mistake is often that you think it's going to work exactly like it does in your home country. And sometimes that is a good approximation, but sometimes not. Because if you, for example, come from an EU country or maybe also from Canada, then you might think that basically the government controls your health insurance plan in some way. Either they regulate it or it's even the government's plan and you're used to the system. I have health insurance from country X. But if you go abroad or if you become a full-time nomad, that isn't necessarily the case. Because very often now this is the first time when private insurance actually becomes an option for you. It means that you will have real choices, but it also means you will have strategic decisions to make that can make it complex, and you should probably not make the wrong decision. So, as I said, at home, very often you might have a mandatory plan that is in some way controlled by the government, which means you have limited choices and less to worry about. Whereas as an expat, you often leave the system. Let's say you move from Europe to Latin America or to Asia. Very often the country you're moving to will have less rules, giving you more choice, but also more options. If you're lucky and if you optimize things, well, you can actually save a lot of money with private health insurance and get better care at the same time. Health insurance, and therefore also the country you're moving to, can become really a strategic decision, not just some administrative checkbox. Because similar to how you choose a country maybe based on taxes, it will really influence both your bank account, but of course also your health in the long run, both in terms of the coverage you can get, but also in terms of the cost you're going to have for health insurance. So don't take it lightly, look at all the details. It's really going to pay off, because don't just take the plan that you're forced into. It could be a big mistake. The first thing you need to understand is the difference between full coverage and supplemental plans. In many countries, there's sort of a government plan. It offers more or less full coverage, and then you might be aware of supplemental plans. You might be happy with some form of full international coverage plan, but you might also need additional stuff. All the usual stuff should be included, like illness, accidents, hospital stays. Also, it should ideally be globally available, especially if you're a nomad, if you're changing countries every few weeks or months, then you will definitely need this. And also, of course, it will give you a lot of more leverage to save on healthcare costs or get better treatment for the same cost. And then on top of that, you might add also supplemental insurance. If whatever main plan you have, has some gaps here and there, you can fill them, especially if the main plan is from a government. Very often there might be some gaps depending on what you do, especially if you do some riskier sports or if you travel a lot throughout the world, you might want to have additional coverages. Another mistake you might make is, especially if you come from Europe and you move to some Latin American or sometimes Asian country, is that you might underestimate how weak a government plan can be. You think it provides full coverage, but then it doesn't really. And the same also goes for Europe, for example. So don't make this mistake of thinking I'm going to have my residency in somewhere in the EU and this means I have global coverage, because no, typically you have coverage only in the European economic area. So outside of that, especially in expensive countries like North America, you might not be covered. And this is where you need additional coverage. So let's talk a bit about a few mistakes I see people make very often. I see so many people on Facebook groups say things like, I have health insurance already from my credit card, or, I pay like 100 euros per year or something. This is travel insurance. It's not health insurance. Like, it's technically health insurance, but it only covers in cases like emergencies abroad, and then normally they will send you home. Why? Because the idea is that typically they only cover some small stuff that's maybe not covered by whatever your main insurance is. For any big stuff, they will send you home. And this home might not be a good option for you because maybe you don't have any coverage there, so you end up paying out of pocket. Or you just don't get good treatment at wherever the home is. Let's say, for example, you register in some Latin American country as a nomad. Maybe you actually don't want to go there. So you can be really screwed if you just have travel insurance. Don't underestimate this. It's cheap, it appears flexible because maybe you can buy it for a certain trip where you feel like there's a higher risk. But in the end, it's for vacation, things like these. They will always send you towards your main insurance country and plan. And if you don't have a good one, you're screwed. It's not possible to save that much money. You can't get your healthcare costs down to like 100 euros per year. This would be too good. But you can save a lot of money, don't worry. The real problem is you need some main plan together with travel insurance, otherwise it's just not going to work. Why do you actually need a full coverage and what does it contain? So one thing obviously is chronic disease, because this is where it gets expensive. Arguably, if you just do checkups all the time, or if you maybe even smaller things like breaking a hand, wrist, or so, this tends to be relatively inexpensive. But chronic diseases, including cancer, they can get really, really expensive. This is where you need the full coverage. Also, mental health. If you're listening to this video, chances are you work a lot with your brain, meaning you're under a higher risk of things like a burnout, for example, which can sometimes be costly because it could actually take a year or many years to be cured if you have a serious case. And then you also want that included in your health insurance, because this is literally why you have health insurance. Also, any form of longer term treatment, even if it's not a mental thing, be it some rehab, maybe you broke your leg in a really serious way or something worse, this will get very costly, and this is why you want to have that included in your plan. Also, of course, all sorts of accidents and recoveries, because in some systems this is separated a bit, where you sort of have health insurance just for being sick, but then accidents are under a different system or plan. Just be sure that this is included, be it under one plan ideally, or if not, then get additional coverage for this. So medical evacuation is often underestimated, not because it's excluded, but very often in health insurance plans there are relatively low caps. So for example, something like 5,000 euros might not be enough in many countries throughout the world if you're in the mountains. Also in countries where you think it's cheaper, just because a country is cheap doesn't necessarily mean that medical evacuation is cheap. You want the extreme but unlikely cases covered, so make sure that it's not just covered, but also that the limits are not low, but instead are high, or it's unlimited. Don't save just so you're not fully covered. It just doesn't pay off to, save 20, 50 euros per month and then have only the half the coverage you really need in extreme cases. In the end, I think this is not a good trade-off. Choosing countries and also health insurance plans, it can have a huge effect on your life, not just because of your health, but also because it affects your bank account. And with that connected is what country you're going to. It's a bit similar to taxes. The country you're going to influences your taxes, but it influences also the healthcare options that you have. Choose a job in a country, or that you can do from a country where healthcare is good and also affordable. You have cost, you have quality, and you have waiting time for sort of serious stuff that is not an emergency. Some countries you should really be careful with. The US, obviously, because it has exceptionally high cost, in many cases the highest cost in the world. It might lead to medical debt if you're not careful. But also Canada. Canada, for example, is usually understaffed, so you might have long waiting times. I've really heard from some Canadians, they went to a hospital and waited for many hours to get treated, or sometimes they wouldn't get treated that day and they had to come back the next day or something. As long as you don't have something super serious, you might say, okay, so be it. But if you have something super serious, this is why you really need doctors and hospitals and insurance companies. Then you will be in trouble, and they have limited options in terms of private healthcare, which can be annoying if you're a nomad, because you might not fit into the public system. So be careful with Canada. Also the UK, for a European country, I would say it's relatively expensive. Keep in mind, this is just a selection. There are certainly more countries where healthcare is troublesome, but these I think definitely are worth mentioning, especially if you're an expat, nomad, or similar. In contrast, you have a few countries where the value, I would say, is really good. Japan is certainly a good example. You have really high quality, you have reasonable cost, it's very efficient. Also Thailand, you have world-class private hospitals that you can use with your private insurance. Portugal and Spain are also pretty good. Even the public system seems to be good there, but especially the private system is actually worth mentioning and not too costly. Germany is also quite good. It's obviously a bit more expensive than, for example, Portugal and Spain. But on the other hand, the standard is very high, and for such a kind of generally more expensive industrial nation, given all the regulation that Germany has, I would say it's a relatively efficient option still. Also, a few rising stars are there. Latvia is not quite there yet where Germany is, or maybe Japan, but it is cost effective for certain things. So the point here is that very often if you have something that is expensive enough so optimization makes sense, but it's not an immediate emergency, dental procedures are a good example of that, then you can actually get that at much more reasonable prices across the world if you travel anyways, if you can maybe combine it with visiting that country for the first or second time or visiting friends, then this gives you a lot more options as an expat or a nomad. In one case, it's also worth mentioning Switzerland. While Switzerland has probably one of the best healthcare systems in terms of pure quality, it can become really expensive if you're a non-resident. You got to be careful that Switzerland is even included in the plan. Similar maybe a bit to the US. Even Switzerland's healthcare is often less expensive than the US healthcare. One other distinction is, when you're moving to a new country or returning to your home country, one thought to keep in mind is you might actually want to keep your existing insurance if you can. For example, if you're leaving a country with a really good health insurance system, maybe Germany is an example where if you have private health insurance, you can, at least in theory, use that everywhere in the world. And it might really make sense to maybe pause that, because while you're in some other country, you could maybe get a different plan that's cheaper, but you might want to sort of freeze your plan. So if you ever come back to Germany in this case, or whatever your home country is, then it could actually make sense keeping that and then reactivating it at a later point without running through new health checks. But it really depends. Sometimes it works, sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't work, sometimes it doesn't make sense. It's really something that you need to look into carefully. What is sort of a common thing though is that re-entry is not always guaranteed into private systems. Government systems, of course, they will always take you. That's why they also are so expensive, because they take everybody and they have to sort of account for that. For all sorts of the really good private insurance systems, if you come back a few years later, you're going to be older, you might have some chronic diseases in the meantime, and then there might be gaps in your coverage because they might say, we're not covering this, we're going to limit your new insurance. So be careful about re-entry if you cancel your previous plan. Very often the smart strategy can be keeping your existing health insurance, either because you can actually still use it, or you just sort of freeze it for a small fee per month where it will now be inactivated, but you could reactivate it without a new health check. That's the important thing, because this can really save you massive problems later. Now, one thing is really worth noting, why is even all of this possible? You might not think, why is government insurance often so expensive? Well, the thing is that government insurance takes everybody in, which means that they of course have to, pay for people who don't pay that much attention to their healthcare. The private companies, who in not all cases, but some cases are much cheaper, especially if you're young and healthy, they don't take everybody. This is why they can be cheaper. In terms of international plans, very often they don't save for later, for higher ages, so your premiums would actually go up. This is sort of another optimization you can do if you're still young and healthy for a couple of years, be under this cheaper plan. If you're a nomad, usually, if you have chronic diseases or anything serious, then this will usually limit your coverage, or they might just not take you at all. But if you're lucky, you can have significant savings. I'm just going to again take Germany as an example, because this one I know very well. I think it extends to certain countries, like Austria is similar, for example. In Germany, you might actually pay a lot. If you are a software engineer, you usually pay around 600 to 800 for healthcare. Half of it might be paid by your employer, but as I explained in another video, it doesn't really matter, because they could be paying it out to you. So actually you, including your employer's part, pay this much in the public system. And even if you're under private insurance, you have a really comprehensive plan, you might also have a premium like this. If you are under some expat insurance plans, if you're young and healthy, no chronic diseases, etc., you might save a lot of that. You might pay a fraction of that, more in the ballpark of 100 to 200 euros, and you might even have better coverage, right? This is sort of the big irony. Why is that? Because these plans are calculated differently. In the one plan, you're basically paying for all the people who are already old and have chronic diseases, whereas in the less expensive plan, you're sort of paying only for your own risk. You can argue about this politically for a long time, I'm not going to do that today. This is just for your information, so you're aware of how this works. On the other side, if you do have chronic conditions, then very often you will just be rejected or your coverage will be severely limited. So this will kind of limit options of where maybe you could be living, or at least where you could be a resident of. This will sometimes mean that then you have to stay in some government plan, which means that coverage and access to private doctors might not be as good, but at least they take you in. And of course, it tends to be more expensive and tends to come with additional tax payments and so on. The key takeaway here is it's kind of like a leverage tool. If you know what you're doing, then using international expat / nomad insurance can be really, really good for you. It can save you a lot of money. It can give you access to better healthcare, but it's not a universal solution that works for everyone. You really need to spend some time, look into this carefully with a consultant, because there's so many things you can overlook. And don't save on your health. It's the one thing that you cannot really buy back. You can only sort of buy the prevention now. To sum this all up, basically, health insurance often feels unimportant at first. If you set this up wrong, it can become very expensive later. If you set it up right, it gives you the freedom and peace of mind that you deserve. If it is wrong, it can slowly turn a great relocation into a long-term problem. And the truth is, most expats do not struggle because of, just visas or salaries, but they struggle because they overlook risk like this. In the next video, I will show you which decisions look smart when moving abroad, but often become costly mistakes later. If you're planning a move, you should watch that video next. It can save you years of fixing avoidable errors and a lot of money. See you in the next one.